I'm not here to cover a breaking event. I'm not here to report to a waiting and far-flung audience. But the opportunity to play the Sheldonian doesn't come up very many times in one's life, so you've got to take it when it's offered. Of course, the great challenge is when people start to lose focus and start staring at the scenery, we know we've got to pick up the pace here on the stage. For me, it's the highest praise to say of any task, it's interesting duty. So when I was asked to be here today, all I could think of was that it is interesting duty. To be asked to facilitate a conversation with a group of people who've been doing such life-transforming work. The intention of the panel is not to be laudatory, more useful instead. The panel is not here for a pat on the back in front of a room full of people who are also in the arena, but to deliver their best thinking on harnessing power, challenging power, on the problem-solving, challenges and hard-won successes in bringing social enterprise from the conceptual stage to that of robust ongoing concerns and the new challenges that arise when you make the transformation from upstart to ongoing enterprise. And we'll hear from President Robinson, who comes from the world of electoral politics, not social entrepreneurship, so takes a slightly different view from a leader who's now looking to leverage the power and smarts already at community level to make scaled-up systematic change around the world. Some brief introductions of the panel, and I steer you to your conference booklet because these are wildly accomplished people, and really I don't want to spend inside such a short envelope all this time telling you of their many accomplishments. Kailash Satyarthi is one of the best-known leaders in the global movement to end child labor and child slavery. He built and led the global march against child labor. He's pushed up against governments loath to act against business and slow to enforce the laws, and he's also had to push down against communities slow to change cultural norms around child labor. And as president of the Global Campaign for Education, he's insisted on education as a basic human right, linking education to the battle against child labor. Daniel Lubetzky is the founder and chairman of PeaceWorks Holdings, a for-profit business. He's also the leader of the PeaceWorks Foundation and the One Voice movement. And I guess the easiest and clearest way to sum up the aims of One Voice is to say that it flows from Daniel's and now 650,000 signatories' belief that the only way for Israelis and Palestinians to achieve freedom and peace is for the other side to achieve the same. And finally, the Honourable Mary Robinson, the first woman to serve as Ireland's president, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and particularly germane for this afternoon's conversation, chair of the International Institute for Environment and Development, and the president of Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative. Please welcome our panel. Now, Daniel, you've said it's very important to understand the difference between being a grassroots movement and an organization. What did you mean by that, and why is the difference important?
Well, I'm still trying to figure. Can you hear me? I'm still trying to figure that out for myself. Only in the last several months have we actually started realizing that we still have a long ways to go to really become worthy of being called a movement. My favorite realization was in the last 2-3 trips that I've taken to the region where our youth leaders were complaining all the time, and for me that was a real source of them taking ownership. So I actually really liked it, that in the last couple of occasions that I was talking to them, they were always complaining because they were saying, why are we not doing enough? Why are we not taking more ownership? Why did you take these decisions without consulting with us? And when we came up with the idea for One Voice, a confused Mexican Jew getting Arabs and Israelis to work together, and you know the conflict is not going to be resolved if it continues that way. It has to ultimately be owned by the Israeli and Palestinian people that are living on the ground day to day. And eventually, over the course of many years of tinkering with how to create a network that can both grow but maintain its adherence to its values, we realized that the course is at the movement level, with the youth leaders taking more and more decisions. So increasingly we're letting them self-elect and take more and more decisions in how the decisions are taken. But it's not a very easy thing to do, because when you have 650,000 signatories, out of which maybe several thousand are very deeply involved, how do you reach decisions among thousands, and how do you try to get consensus? How do you try to get the movement to lead, but also to represent? And there's a very, very tricky balance, not the least of trying to engage the youth leaders in trying to forge those decisions, which decisions have to be actually taken by the movement and which have to be organizational decisions by the staff. In the last 3 months, we've had one of our toughest moments of reckoning, when the Gaza war divided the Israeli and Palestinian youth leaders more than ever, and they were sitting on the same table, realizing that they actually have a lot of things that they disagree on. And we're called One Voice Movement, and a lot of say is like, people say you have 100 Israelis and Palestinians in a room, you're going to have 101 opinions. Why are you calling yourselves One Voice? And the point is that in spite of the many differences that Israelis and Palestinians have among themselves, and let alone between each other, they try to find those areas of consensus about how to move forward, and they're based on the future and a future of coexistence. But sometimes you need to push that vision a little bit, because sometimes we all are proud of supporting a two-state solution, but you realize that what the two-state solution means for Israelis and what it means for Palestinians actually is quite distant, and so you need to press forward while listening to your constituents and trying to get them to own that progressive leadership without getting too far ahead of the people that you claim to represent.
More on that later. Kailash, you met with success. You achieved your objective of changing the laws regarding child labor in your country. Were you done?
Well, it's a good question. Some laws are made in India. We have also been successful in making new laws worldwide. International conventions and treaties are there. But it is not enough. All the time I feel that law is a tool or a weapon, but it requires strong hands. It requires mind. It requires a clear sight, a heart, and a clear vision. How are you going to use that weapon? And that is non-existing in many cases. Laws are there, but the people are not prepared to use those laws. So we have to prepare those people, and that is the empowerment of people. That is the power shift, or whatever name you give. But the question is that how are you going to address the vital questions of structural or institutional power, the invisible power which is wasted in your mindset and biases which are prevailing in many ways, like the caste bias in India, gender bias in many parts of the world, apartheid, many kind of things. So that is the basic question. How we are going to address all these visible powers and invisible powers in favor of the people so that the law could work and law could be implemented. So law is not enough. For instance, in my case, I started freeing slave children without knowing whether the law exists or not, because some parents came to me and requested that their children have been trapped, kidnapped, put to work like slaves, sold and bought like animals, or even lesser price than the animals. Then I could not wait. So I started work. It was about 30 years ago. But then I realized that much of the legal provisions are not in my favor. So I have to fight for the law. When the law was there, then I realized that it is not enough. We have to work for implementation of those laws, and that cannot work only through the judicial recourses. It will work only through people's movement. So the mass participation, the coalition building with like-minded organizations, and the multi-stakeholder partnership, all those strategies were discovered in the process so that the laws can work, which is not easy. So one has to discover new strategies once you achieved the first.
But does everybody have to agree on what the goal is? If you're making these coalitions, do you have to have a set of ideas that everybody has to sign on to in order to participate?
Well, we have to find out some of the basic common understanding, or what we call the minimum common program. We cannot make everyone agree on everything. But there are some principles. If we have to fight against child slavery and make sure that all children should receive good quality free education and be free from any kind of exploitation and injustice and slavery, then many people can agree upon it, or many organizations can agree upon it. But when we go to the nitty-gritties of the politics, when we go into the ideological nitty-gritties, then it becomes a problem. So we have to, so in my case, for instance, when we launched this global march against child labor, more than 2,000 organizations worldwide joined hands with me. It was a miracle for many people. They thought that how could it be possible? Because some of them were trade unions, some others were the teachers' unions, but others were religious groups, churches. In the march, the extreme rightist people and the extreme so-called leftist people were marching hand in hand because both wanted that child slavery has to be abolished from the world. So the minimum common understanding and minimum common agenda with some program instead of going to everything.
Now, you've seen this from both sides, Madam President. As a politician, had petitions dropped on your desk with thousands of signatories, people who are strangers to you, but also now in your second career, trying to unleash that same power. How does it look from those two different desks?
I think I've always been very both energized and somehow drawn on the resourcefulness of what happens in communities. I remember when I was actually, as politicians do, looking for votes to be elected President of Ireland. And that's when you really get to know a country. I was in the inner city, I was in small villages, I was on the islands, and that was in 1990. And I saw a lot of self-development of communities. And they said to me, well, if you're elected, because it was a big if, will you come back? And I kind of said, well, I'm very interested in what you're doing. Yes, I'd like to come back. Oh, they all say that. And then when I was in my office as president, I got invitations to come back and open centers, be involved in local community, excitement about what had been achieved. And I noted that the advice I was getting from my secretariat as president was, this event is not important enough to warrant the presence of the president. And I got a couple of these advices, and I thought, who decides? Who decides what's important? It's a kind of very interesting thing. And I've noted, we were hearing about President Obama. He's somebody who is deciding for himself where he will be as president, how he will communicate with people, how he will continue to energize himself by staying very close to people. And I think he's absolutely right. I think it is very important. The same thing when I was serving as High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I traveled to countries with terrible conflict, but always found, because I was meeting women's groups, those tackling poverty, those tackling child slavery, child labor, the energy. I felt it this evening, actually, coming into this room. It's my first time at this Skoll Forum. That sense of people who have a purpose in life, who have values that are important to them. And I think when you're exercising a leadership, it's very energizing to understand what people are doing. And yet, when we talk about a shift in power, I would say one of the shifts that's taking place in this severe economic crisis, which is, of course, hurting the poorest, is a recognition that government matters. And I think that's very important in the 21st century, because we were in a neoliberal phase when there was a reduction of the importance of government, and the private sector was supposed to be so efficient, and we didn't need regulation. I'm hoping that we can now see a new era of more responsible government, more appropriate regulation, but also the energies of the citizens, people, being able, with all the tools of the information society, to be able to be very creative and to participate in their communities, in their society, in their movements, which is one of the strengths of both Daniel and Kailash. So when I came back from visits, and it's still true now in my work as Realizing Rights, my colleagues would say to me, you should be exhausted, but you're energized. And I really find that you learn so much from what people do in very difficult circumstances to change those circumstances. That's real leadership.
Well, as luck would have it, you two were creating mass movements in countries that didn't have Mary Robinson as president. So how do you create the impression of power that makes a government pay attention?
Well, since I have been working with the children who are supposed to be the most powerless, the children who are denied their education, the children denied their freedom and childhood and future, they are perhaps the most powerless people. But I strongly believed right from the day one that until and unless we unleash the tremendous moral power which exists in those communities, in those people, we cannot bring about the sustainable change. For instance, I will give you an example that when hundreds of children who were victims of slavery and trafficking and child prostitution and some of the former child soldiers knocked the door, and Mary Robinson was there in the United Nations Plaza in Geneva at the time of ILO convention, 180 labor ministers stood up, and they were all shocked to see when a child stands up and goes to the dais and says that, are you so poor that you cannot take out the tools from my hand? Are you so poor that you cannot provide me a book or a toy? The world is not so poor. A child says like that. And the tremendous moral power was generated in that room, and no government, no minister could say no to a child. And a result was that an agreement was made immediately, within 2 or 3 days' time, that an international convention would be signed in principle, and in a year time, next year means in 1999, within a year, a new international law came to an existence, which has been signed by all the governments of the world, and it has become the fastest ever ratified UN convention on the worst forms of child labor. That's the people's power.
I would never suggest underestimating the force of moral power.
Yeah.
But you were working in a situation where, in times, the government was indifferent. Parents themselves, who needed the income produced by those children, often weren't sure that they were on your side. And the factory owners were all too happy to use the cheapest workers in the world to continue to make the things they made. So you had to harness power in a way that would make some very entrenched interests not only say, oh yes, I agree, it's terrible that we have children who are worked this way, but actually do something besides what they were already doing and very happy to do.
No, let me tell you that most important thing is to have a dream. And that dream and that vision have to be shared with the victims and their families and the communities. Without that, it's not possible. The dream is that all children receive good quality education and they can compete with any of the president or prime minister's child in the world. That dream has to be there. How are you going to share that dream? And that needs a very strong commitment. That needs a very strong passion. That needs a very relentless work. And that has to be there, first of all. The second thing is that you cannot just work on emotions. You have to build strong arguments and strong rationals behind your work. So passion and rational argument. What argument is there? For instance, today in the world, 218 million children are the victims of various forms of child labor and slavery and so on. It's a big number. But 185 million adults are totally jobless. And unfortunately, the number has increased in last 3-4 months' time in this recession. So it is more or less same, 200 million child laborers, 200 million adults jobless. The strong argument is that, who are these jobless adults? Most of the jobless adults are the very parents or family members of these children who don't find the jobs. Children are preferred because they are the cheapest source of labor. They are free labor in many cases. They can work long hours a day. They could be exploited easily. And they are denied education and everything. So argument was there very simple that if from India, for instance, where we have 60 million child laborers and 60 million adults jobless, my argument was that if you remove those 60 million children from jobs, you are going to create at least 60 million jobs in the country. And these 60 million jobs will not be given to the Americans or the neighboring country, Pakistan. So don't be afraid of it. These jobs will go to able-bodied, jobless Indians. That has to be understood. And more importantly, the value of education, because education is the key to all your successes. There's no doubt about it that education brings further power. It is the key to rest of the powers and human rights. You cannot get rid of poverty, you cannot get rid of social exclusion and the cultural bias without education. And that dream has to be built, and you should have that power to share that dream. And the more important thing in that process is that, can you prove in your own life? If you are just preaching, and if you are not living with those people and not showing the change slowly through your own deeds, you keep on preaching, then it won't work. So that is also equally important thing, that what you speak, have to practice.
Daniel?
First of all, this is a testament to why the Skoll Forum makes sense, because this man's been doing this for 30 years, and if I had known this maybe 7 or 8 years ago, we would have tried to download a little bit more of his experiences and would have probably moved a lot faster. So I think that's why this conference is so valuable. I find a lot of parallels in how you think through issues to how we're dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I just want to provide a couple of thoughts on that and then more practical reactions to your question. For us, we also think the way you describe dream, for us, we're talking about visualizing what the end to the conflict can mean, because we did a survey a few months ago, and now it would be even worse results. The vast majority of Israelis and Palestinians have basically resigned themselves to the fact that this conflict is going to not be resolved, that this is going to be an intractable, eternal conflict, and you use language like that about how this is what's going to happen. And so long as people cannot visualize a different future, imagine a two-state solution, they're very unlikely to then invest themselves and mobilize towards achieving that solution. And so one of the programs we did last year was called Imagine 2018, where we're trying to ask children and then filmmakers and others to try to help give shape to what that vision would look like. And again, it's like what Skoll does at the end every year with headlines of where are we aiming and getting people to believe that that can happen. The second challenge, and I think this is the biggest one, certainly in the Middle East, and you probably can be a testament to this, is getting people to believe that they can forge that change, because we've been desensitized into believing in the Middle East that it's about the governments. The Palestinian Israeli people are expecting a great messianic figure to come from the top and just resolve the conflict, and that's not going to happen. And talking about the power shifts, it's really incumbent upon us to get citizens to understand that nobody's going to do it for them. There are a few politicians, but there's 10 million Israelis and Palestinians living with the consequences of their decisions. And if you are able to harness and tap that reservoir of goodwill, if you're able to try to channel that to constructive ways, you will win ultimately. You will achieve it, because the people are fed up with the conflict. They want a resolution, the way you described it better than I, about how you're only going to get freedom and security on both sides if you recognize that the other side also needs to have that. And so you need to get people to understand that they have the power and the responsibility to play that role. And then our role is to give them tools to try to help amplify their voices, come up with creative ways for the media to pay attention. And so now I'm going to get very tactical and practical in case it helps anybody. Otherwise, doze off for the next 2 minutes. But how do you get politicians to listen to you? First, you need to leverage the media. So I'll tell you this story real quickly, just a little bit as a funny story. We first went to the media and we told them that we're building this movement of Israelis and Palestinians that wanted a two-state solution. And most people in the media kind of dozed off and they said, that's good, but what you need to have is people from opposing sides coming together so that you can highlight how, drastically how this exists. So we went and we recruited some people with hawkish credentials on the Israeli and Palestinian side. We showed it to them, little stories here or there, but then they're like, well, that's good, but you need to get high-level dignitaries on your board from opposing sides, and then there will be an interesting story. So we actually formed a 60-member honorary board with Palestinians and Israelis from all spectrums of politics. We brought it forth. A couple stories like, that's good, but this is the politicians. Of course, they're just pandering this, they're not going to do this. You need a story of hope, a story of a human being who's doing something remarkable. So we found this guy that was a farmer who was making $2 a day living wage, and who nevertheless found the afternoons to go distribute ballots to recruit people, and he was going out into faraway villages on his donkey. And I thought it was a very powerful story of personal sacrifice. We thought, okay, that's interesting, fine, but he's not going to transform the world. You need to try to find. Certainly, in the course of what we were doing, we had, by fortuity, people in the Hollywood community, Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston and Jason Alexander and Danny DeVito hosted us, and then started supporting us, and somehow we hadn't even announced it. It leaked into the media, and for like 3 days nonstop, we kept getting phone calls. Oh, Brad Pitt is going to make peace in the Middle East. This is, and it was ridiculous, and quite dangerous also, because suddenly people thought, oh, this is the celebrity movement with Brad Pitt is going to make peace, which of course was not what we thought his role is. But celebrities and the media have a very important role to play in helping put the spotlight on the people. And as you adjust the power of dignitaries, we troubled the president last year when we were trying to do an event for her to co-chair an event. You have to find ways to get dignitaries, luminaries, celebrities to try to put the spotlight on those causes, on the children, on the young Israelis and Palestinians, because whether we like it or not, there's not that many Ray Suarez's out there, and the media normally wants what was the woman that you said that was not the topic of the news? The singer?
No, Britney Spears.
It was not Britney Spears, then they're going to be interested.
President, you've been thinking about, writing about, talking about global climate change and the fact that the big emitters are some of the most powerful countries on Earth, some of the wealthiest countries on Earth, and some of the places where it's being felt most keenly are some of the poorest and most powerless people on Earth. How do they scale up a demand to the most powerful places on the Earth that something has to change?
It's something I'm really very interested in, and very interested to get the world of social entrepreneurs to think about, because we do a lot of work in African countries. In fact, I've just been in Liberia, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Rwanda in the last week or so. In all three countries, climate change isn't something of the future. The weather is not predictable. The farmers don't know when to sow. They have more desertification, more flooding, and people are suffering shocks, and they can't afford these shocks. And I was in Rwanda last September as well for a conference with an interesting title. The title was Climate Change, Adaptation, Development, and Human Rights, all in the title. Co-organized, in fact, by the London School of Economics and the government of Rwanda. And we learned that the whole continent of Africa is responsible for about 3.8% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And yet, the effects are really severe and are becoming more severe and are retarding these famous Millennium Development Goals, which African countries in particular and South Asia were struggling to achieve. And what really interests me as a human rights person is that climate change is not a natural phenomenon like a tsunami or an earthquake. It's caused by our human behavior over decades, the lifestyles that we have chosen, and those lifestyles have made us feel better and prosperous until the recent economic crisis at least. But those chosen lifestyles are dramatically worsening the vulnerable life chances of the women and children and citizens of the poorest countries. And it's happening in a cause and effect way. How do we address the challenge of that? Some of us have been grappling, and it is grappling. There's a publication of the International Council on Human Rights Policy called Climate Change and Human Rights, a Rough Guide, because we know we're only beginning to think about this. We've begun to look at possible guidelines, which I hope will become principles of climate justice. I've noted that some of the former awardees, and indeed this year's awardees, are interested in justice, the Center for Transitional Justice, which I know very well. And we need to think about a concept of climate justice and equity. We're looking at principles that draw on very well-known ideas. The Rio conference in 1992 talked about the concept of the polluter pays. We need burden sharing to be equitable. We need a common and differentiated approach, which is being talked about in the context of Copenhagen, to become genuinely an equitable idea that is people-centered, not a technical idea. Wangari Maathai talks about what each of us can do, and she uses 3 words which I think are very compelling, and they are reuse, reduce, recycle. So every one of us can contribute in that sense. But I feel very strongly that social entrepreneurs are a kind of bridge between the fact that it's the rich world and the big corporations and big enterprises, big mining, big oil companies, etc., and the Gulf states too, that have been responsible for these emissions. And one of the ways in which we can find that climate change nexus, that idea of being just and equitable, is the transfer of technologies. It's in the Copenhagen arrangements. It's one of the pillars to talk about the technologies. But how do we achieve this? I think, first of all, we have to be thinking from the drawing board, not just about technologies that President Obama is trying to now invigorate in the United States with the stimulus package, green alternative energies. How can we ensure that from the beginning we're talking about the poorest billions who must benefit? But it's really, I think, the social entrepreneurs that are that bridge, that wedge too, because they are the ones who are devising the solar power for the communities, the water purification, the water harvesting. I think there's a great opportunity for the Skoll Forum to bring together those who have solutions locally, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge about climate change, and then demand a scaling up, demand a funding so that the billions can benefit. I mean, the technology that gives me that sense of what is possible is the mobile phone. In the poor camps and villages that I was in the Goma region in eastern DRC, everyone had a mobile phone. It is the technology of now. There are so many applications, there are so many other ways in which we could change. I mean, you talked about a vision. I have this sense, and I've been kind of waking up to it recently, and I can see it. I can see a village in Africa, the kind of village that I'm in from time to time, where the women in village A are selling electricity to the village next door because the committee of women have been able to take better care of the solar panels, manage their electricity, and there's a grid so that this is happening. And the children have light, and they study. And that is the world that we have to, and is it going to be in 5 years' time, or is it going to be in 10 years' time? Social entrepreneurs can make it happen quicker than anyone.
That's a great vision for self-reliance and building something at village level that alleviates needs that are felt right then and there. But Kailash found a way to reach from rural India, town India, to the department stores of the Western world about who puts the knots in those rugs. Journalists found a way when someone was walking into a jewelry store and buying something with diamond chips in it instead of diamonds to explain, well, no, some kid whose ankle is chained to the ground in a jewelry subcontractor is the one who's grinding those diamond chips. Is it necessary to build a bridge, as you talked about bridge builders, from that village in the DRC to me sitting in my office in Washington, to somebody sitting in a traffic jam in Los Angeles?
Yes, and that's the other potential, issues, approaches like the Center for Transitional Justice or the Bridges for Justice with their public defenders, the accountability of local government, the accountability of what's happening at the national or international level, whether it's for child labor, whether it's for the diamonds that have required this Kimberley process one of the tragedies of the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's one of the richest countries in the world, but its resources have been exploited horribly by neighbors and by international corporations. And if you're in a city like Kinshasa with 10 million people, the poverty there is devastating. And so what we need is holding governments to account for their responsibility, both to have proper regulations, to tackle corruption, to govern for their people, but also to energize people to be entrepreneurial, to use the possibilities. But the climate justice, climate equity issue is how do we transfer the technologies and have the adaptation funds greatly increased to support indigenous knowledge to cope with climate shocks. And that's where the kind of entrepreneurial spirit of social entrepreneurs, I think, can come in. But some of those social entrepreneurs are those who are holding government to account, holding corporations to account. And we need more of that.
How do you stay focused over the long haul? How do you keep pressure in the pipe, keep moving in the direction that you've set for your organization, if, as it gains more adherents and more supporters, you almost inevitably water down that purity of purpose, that focus on very well-defined goals?
Well, the focus is definitely the most important thing, but simultaneously one can learn out of the experiences. When you climb up the hill, first hill, and then you suddenly discover that there is another hill, then there is another hill. But the most important thing is the lesson learned from climbing up the first hill. And then you can stand with your high head and with pride that at least I have climbed up the first hill, but I'm not going to stop here. I'm going to climb up the second one and the third one and the fourth one until and unless I solve the problem which I'm committed for. So that goes on. We can learn from the experience, but we can also learn from the successes. If we don't get any success in any manner, then it's very hard to keep the momentum alive. And it's also a technique that how are you going to market your success, how are you going to infuse that success to build the self-esteem of the people who are involved in a social movement for change. So that's also equally important. Then you can use the media, you can use the celebrities, you can invent many tactics how to do it. But the purpose and the focus have to be there. Here is also a matter of interconnectivity. The problems of global nature and the problems of local nature are now very much interconnected. What we can see, the globalization of the problems, may it be the climate, may it be the terrorism, may it be the illiteracy, or may it be the trafficking of human beings. These problems are interdependable or interconnected. You cannot say that this is localized problem of a village in Congo and this is the problem of United States of America. Somebody who is born in Afghanistan or in India or in Pakistan or in some parts of the world can create a big horror here in this part of the world if somebody decides to become a suicidal bomber or something like that. So we have to see that the things are so interconnected, and we have to see the interconnectivity in solutions also. Normally, when we think of interconnectivity of solutions, we make it very complex. I believe in simplicity. I want to find simple answers to any complex problem, and that works. Because you have to go with a very simple message to the people, only then they are with you. Otherwise, they will leave you some time after you, when you keep on making theoretical and academic analysis of the problem. We have to go with the solutions, not with the problems to the people. And that focus of solution has to be there. If you make a small solution, that solution should be used as seed to build another solution, and then seed to build another solution. It goes on, and it works.
Is that tougher to find in your case? Because this problem in one voice, that one voice is trying to fight, seems intractable. You don't get up to the top of a hill to see another hill. Everybody's at the bottom of the hill arguing about whether to climb it or not.
Oh, thank you, Ray. I was going to start by saying that I think that one of the things that's most critical is personally taking stock and refilling your hope and your energy. You know, I have the easy part because I don't live in the Middle East. I just have a 3-month-old baby that, I don't know if I should say this, but was conceived here last year at the Skoll Forum when I got the award last year. But I promised myself I would not say that, but I just can't.
Oxford is known as such a romantic town in that way.
But you need to I spend a lot of my time now increasingly in New York. My partners that are living in Gaza, in Tel Aviv, in Ramallah, that are seeing all the realities every day, and they're hearing their community members and their brethren question their vision, are the ones that take the greatest toll. And you need to find a way to re-energize. And when I come there, I think to a degree, a lot of what they're just looking for is to make sure that I haven't given up. When I come here, when I hear Jeff and others with their determination, it helps me feel that I'm not giving up. And it's really important for your core team, your staff, your youth leader councils, all your leadership to find a way personally to re-energize and to have the staying power. Also in terms of strategy, when we created the movement, we said we don't want to be about conflict management. We want to be a conflict resolution. Conflict management is like, let's deal with the current situation and try to make it a little bit better. Conflict resolution is like, the window is closing, guys. Let's once and for all achieve a two-state solution, end the occupation, end the violence, get Israelis and Palestinians to move on and let the world help them get there. And while that's our goal, sometimes when you have the breakdown of leadership between Hamas and Fatah, which doesn't have a credible government for the table, or when you have the Netanyahu government, which is very unlikely to be a serious partner for two-state solution negotiations, you have to take stock, and I think to Kailash's point, you have to be very careful that you're also realistic and pragmatic about what you can achieve, because you can create a lot of harm if we were to start a mobilization campaign like we've done in the past to push for negotiations and to some degree of success in the past. But now the timing is not right for you to mobilize. So instead you need to start building your base, build your human infrastructure, and find measurable things that you can let your team members be proud of. And there's a lot of things about the movement that are growing in the number of people that are growing in the depth of their understanding. And there are a lot of things that are wrong, and I think that we need to just point out. The conclusion we came this year is that because we can't mobilize the politicians to sit down on the negotiating table right now, and the Middle East changes very fast. Before you know it, the timing might be right. But in the meantime, what we think we need to do is try to challenge Israelis and Palestinians to break the taboos and to deal with their own demons. I was talking earlier about how all our members support a two-state solution, but we have to come to terms with a sobering realization that that definition does not often overlap, that the Israelis' two-state solution and the Palestinians' two-state solution may not coincide. And so we're trying this year with the program Breaking the Taboos to say what needs to be said and to get Israelis and Palestinians to recognize and acknowledge the other side's core needs, that you're not going to get to a two-state solution if you don't make compromises that are going to be painful, but in the end, it'll be a better deal for both sides. And so that you need to shift strategies and gears based on the realities on the ground.
Daniel Lubetzky, Mary Robinson, Kailash Satyarthi, please thank our guests.